Hello, and welcome to this exciting edition of Dr. K's Psychobabble. And today I'm going to be talking about actually one of my favorite theories in social sciences ever. This particular theory probably makes an appearance in every single one of the courses that I've ever taught. It has to do with the ways in which the people around us influence our sense of self. So on one side, we have psychology, which is the how we formulate a cognitive understanding of who we are and our own perceptions of who we are. And on the sociological side, we have the influence of other people, how that affects the way we are. And that theory is, of course, Charles Cooley's looking glass self series. So I'm going to go over the elements of what that is, an extension on it that I refer to as the Looking Glass Committee, and then actions that we can take on the membership and influence of this committee. So let's get started with an understanding of this theory as both a function of psychological identity and sociological influences. So the theory that I'm going to pick, because this particular theory of the self has a lot of sociology in it, is going to be Carl Rogers' theory of the self. Now, Carl Rogers' theory of the self has the self made up of three components. Those components are your true self, the person you really are, the ideal self, which is the kind of person you really want to be or your goals in life. And then there's the self-image. Now, this kind of gives you a little, the nomenclature is a little iffy here, but self-image refers to the image that you portray to society, the way you look, the way you act in ways, the way society would see you. And that's the key here, because we have agency to manipulate our behavior in light of what other people will see. And that's one of the critical things about looking glass self. Now, looking back here on the sociological end of things, within the schools of thought within sociology, this theory arose out of the symbolic interaction perspective. Now, the symbolic interaction perspective within sociology is that social facts, it's a term used to describe culture, norms, values, expectations, roles, status, all of those things. Social facts have meaning to people. Social facts have emotional attachment to those things. So, as a parent, the role of parent defined within my society is something to which I'm attached, and my effort is to act in accordance to my view and my understanding of what it means to be a parent as much as possible. So what we see here from the symbolic interactionist perspective is personal meaning. And from these two perspectives coming together, we get the looking glass self. It was presented by Charles Cooley. Charles Cooley was not a psychologist, he was a sociologist, and he essentially said the social self is derived from our interpretations of others' perspectives of us. Now, Cooley's social self was not only the self that we knowingly project to the world, that acting on the stage part. He emphasized that social self, because it resides within culture and society, it becomes a social fact, a cultural fact, a sociological fact. That creation becomes integrated into our psychological perception of ourselves. I'm going to make this really easy. If there's a person in your world that is important to you, whether you like it or not, they're important to you, and they view you negatively, and in turn, you begin to view yourself negatively, that is the action of the looking glass self. Not only do we have this aspect of ourself that we're showing the world, but people's reaction to that influences the way we truly see ourselves. So let's take a look at the actual looking glass self theory and how it comes about. So the looking glass theory operates on the idea that we look into a mirror. That's what the word looking glass refers to. So Alice fell through the looking glass, fell through the mirror in the original story of Alice in Wonderland. So we look at a mirror, and this mirror we use to examine all of our qualities. We look at ourselves, we look at what we do, we look at the way we look at how we act. There's all these facts that we gather about who we are. We then imagine how other people will see this. How would other people look at me and see these traits that I see? We assess whether those perceptions are positive or negative. What would mom think? What would grandma think? What would my boyfriend, girlfriend think? Kind of, and assess those as positive or negative. And then we incorporate, this is the important part, we take those perceptions and then we make them our own. They become part of our self-perception. So these influences don't only reside outside of us, we actually reinforce them inside of us. And we adopt these perceptions as if they are our own, even when that influence might be gone. So the question is, who are these people? And it's at this point in my understanding, when I was looking at this theory and really diving into how rich it is in terms of understanding our the way others influence our sense of self. I began to think that, for one, for myself, not everybody in the world has that power over me. If I, get dressed for a show and I'm walking down the street on the way to the show and some random person on the street says, "That shirt looks really awful on you." I might listen to it. I might hear like, "What was that all about?" But my reaction would be more like, "Well, what business is it of yours? Whatever." I might look at it, make sure there's nothing wrong with it, but that would be the end of it. But let's say I go backstage and I'm sitting there with the band, and Gerald, the leader of the band, says, "Mark, that sure looks horrible on you." That would have more effect on me. Now, the reason why Gerald's perception would have more effect on me in regard to that behavior, the type of shirt I'm wearing, and the person that was walking down the street doesn't, is because Gerald's opinion is more important, particularly in regard to how I'm dressed and ready and how I perform and how I'm part of his band. Now, looking at that and creating an analogy, okay, I want to propose that each one of us selects individuals, and individuals are selected for us that sit on what I call a looking glass committee. And whenever we're acting in the world, we turn to members of those committee and we say, "What do you think about what I just did?" Maybe it elicits guilt because you know that a person who's on your committee would not feel good about that. Or maybe you've done something really great and it's going to impress somebody on your committee. Either way, those committee members hold strings of power. Now, most of the time, we have individuals that are on there that we had no choice. Family members, parents, brothers, uncles, early interactions like with teachers and stuff like that. We have those kinds of, and they influenced us from the beginning. And to tell you the truth, they sort of always sit on that committee, even though they might not necessarily be a good committee member. And then there are those that we choose. When we choose to have a partner, we want to choose a really good committee member. Our friends, our coworkers, our boss, our job, any one of those things. So let's take a look at how we might construct this particular idea of a committee. So first off, we have ascribed members. And what I mean by that is these are members that are on your committee and you did not choose them. They came with birth. They came with early experiences and whatnot. And then we have achieved members. These are the ones that we get. Now, I stole these terms from the sociological constructs of status. We have achieved status. I became a educated person because I chose and went to college. A ascribed aspect of my identity would be the fact that I was born in Canada. So one of them is ascribed. I didn't have a choice in it. The other one is achieved. I did have a choice in it. So the same use of those terms to describe how members become a part of our committee. So let's look at the ascribed members first. We have our dad. And in this case, we have a happy-go-lucky dad. We have mom, kind of mean. We have our sister, kind of goofy. We have our aunt, teachers, early teachers in our life. And then, don't need to get a little dramatic about this, but Nana was an important part of your life, but she's gone now. That doesn't mean Nana is no longer on your committee. So people who are passed away, excuse the imagery, can still remain on our committee because they still have influence. So let's look at the achieved members, the ones that we pick to put on our committee. Our friends, our partners, maybe our doctor or psychologist or a therapist or Taylor Swift. Got to put in our role models out there. Maybe your teachers, maybe your college teachers. And then finally, what about the role models that exist within spirituality? Many of you might have heard, when I was growing up at least, there was a trend within the Christian community of people wearing those elastic rubber bands around their arm. And it would say, WWJD, what would Jesus do? For those individuals, the figure of Jesus sat on their committee. And in fact, when we choose to follow a faith or to follow a role model or follow a successful person's business plan for creating a successful life, whenever we do that, we're taking that individual and we're putting them on our committee and saying, I want to be like that person. Now, when we're looking at unfallible individuals that we find within religion, we know that that's going to be a lifelong journey and likely will never actually be like that person. But there's no doubt in teaching about success, about moving forward in your life, they often say, find individuals in the world who are doing the things that you want. Put them on your committee. They don't need to be it. They don't even need to know they're on the committee. When we have role models out there, I'm going to be a leader just like Steve Jobs. So I read everything I can about Steve Jobs and I try to emulate his better qualities on what I do in life. And there's Steve, who never knew me, is not alive. I don't call him up. He doesn't send me emails, none of that, but yet he's still on my Looking Glass committee. So you might see here that there's potentially some dynamics here. For one, we're picking some of these and we can then get rid of them or they fade away. Or I'm no longer a Taylor Swift fan, so she's no longer on my committee. or whatever. So let's look at how some of these change over time when we start growing and begin to manage our committee. So here's our committee. We have a sense of self, and each one of these individuals contributes to that sense of self. So let's make believe this is my current Looking Glass Self Committee. Let's manage a little bit. So the first factor that comes up is your mom never gives you credit for your accomplishments. Yet there she is on the committee. You wish she would be different. You wish she would acknowledge you, that that you are successful, even though all those things that can happen. Wish she could acknowledge you that your successes. So what do? Maybe you decide you're going to put her in the corner. She's still on the committee because she's your mom, but you're going to put her in the corner and you're going to lessen the degree to which she influences your sense of self. Now you move on to the next one. Mr. Smith, your teacher, said that you would never amount to anything. Now, I've heard these stories my whole life about teachers saying that. I cannot imagine what would motivate a teacher to say things like that. I had a guidance counselor tell me, don't shoot for the stars. You're too short to reach them, intellectually short to reach them. I mean, wow, that's not fun. And so here we have the teacher. Let's kick him off the committee. Let's make an effort to make sure that those messages that we received when we were young from that teacher are no longer being heard, even though they're just ringing in your head. Then we go through a breakup. And that partner now, whoa, they're mad at you now and saying all kinds of nasty things and whatnot. Maybe you're guilty, maybe they did something, maybe you did something, all that. But now you have this person who was a partner is now an ex, and they're still occupying a space on your committee. Some of you might be able to relate to that. You have new friends from college. So maybe your kind of wacky friends that you were with become maybe more serious friends that you're going to grow into adulthood with. Then you graduate from college. Dr. K isn't your professor anymore, not as immediate, so maybe his influence fades. Still there. Maybe I'll ring him up if I need to have a letter of recommendation or something like that, but not an immediately present influence anymore. Was when I was in his class, but no longer. So the story here is that we have this committee, some of which we've constructed, part of which has been constructed for us, and our task is simply to manage that committee, and by which you would influence the ways in which you would decide how are these individuals going to affect me. And part of the process of development over time is to enable yourself to have the choices to manage this committee. This is all sort of a symbolic way of thinking about how these individuals influence us. But through the years, my students have reflected to me, and I've personally experienced the management of these committees and how useful it is to understand that you are not only the recipient of feedback from this committee, but you're the chair of that committee, and you determine its membership, and you determine the influence of those members. So keep that in mind. And with that, that's the end of this episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble. Be well, and I'll see you next time.